If I were to ask you one thing you remember about 2018's Days Gone, what would it be? Would it be the bad reviews, of which there were quite a few? Would it be the glitches? There were a few of those as well.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Or maybe the apparently terrible and cliched story.
But only if you promise to ride me as much as you ride your bike.
If your answer is yes to all of the above, I'm here to tell you why that is wrong. So settle in and let me take you right back to the beginning and hopefully convince you to give Days Gone a fair cop. Trailers have long been a pain in the arse for devs and gamers alike. I don't want to defend the devs and publishers. They've been putting out over-the-top and over-egged trailers to flog you their games for about as long as I can remember. Cyberpunk 2077, all of that debacle back in December, being the most recent example. Unfortunately, it's a difficult spot. They're in a position where they need to sell you games, and their job is to make those games look as amazing as possible. Consumers, on the other hand, can often get taken in by these sparkly looking presentations with amazing graphics and fantastic, first of its kind gameplay. It doesn't matter whether the final product will actually be anything like that, but that's what they promise and that's what sells you on the pre-orders. I'm guilty of this myself. I pre-ordered Cyberpunk 2077 for God's sake. And outside of drawing up a designer there really wasn't much else to it. Of course, all of this isn't to say that Days Gone fell foul of having a bad trailer. In fact, it's a pretty good representation of the game when you play it on PS5. The issues with Days Gone started with the fact that it clearly wasn't made to run on PS4, at least the base model that is. So while the PS4 Pro and now the PS5 are there for people to enjoy Days Gone as it was made to be, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who picked it up the first time round got to enjoy it in that way. And let's face it, most of us had the base model PS4s, so there really wasn't any excuse for the state in which it came out, unable to run on that hardware. When it was announced at E3 2016, it's safe to say expectations were set fairly high.
Wow!
It's understandable that critics, when they finally got their hands on the game, were quite disappointed. Of course, fans had a bit of a different take on it. And I don't want to say that fans are more easily pleased. In fact, quite often, fans can be the hardest critics of them all. But it does look like that most fans who actually picked up the game gave it much more of a fair shot than the critics. I suppose what I'm saying here is that Days Gone didn't seem to be judged on the metrics of every other game. Whereas long-running franchises which have been doing the same thing for years and years and years seem to get a free pass every year, Days Gone got slated for being unoriginal. But the truth is, does something need to be entirely original to actually be any good? And I don't think it does. The influences on Days Gone are pretty obvious. There's elements of Far Cry in there, and there's a whole lot of The Walking Dead. But it chose to be those things. And yes, they're not entirely original. But what in the gaming industry really is? So, if poor optimisation for the original PS4 and an uneven playing field for those initial reviews messed up Days Gone's reception, what's it actually like to play now? In the interest of full transparency, I picked up Days Gone as part of the free collection on PS5. And to be totally honest, I really wasn't expecting a whole lot going in. I mean, after reading those initial reviews, my expectations were about as low as possible. When I first turned on the game, it just felt like a Daryl Dixon simulator. Riding around on a motorbike, cool biker jacket, crossbow, you name it. The parallels to The Walking Dead are there. But to be honest, about an hour into the game, I actually got a feel for it and really started to enjoy it. Let's start with the melee combat.
First one. You son of a bitch, where you going? Show you the...
this is probably my favourite part of the game. It feels weighty. The weapons feel real. I can only imagine how great it would be on the PS5 with the DualSense controller. And I don't care if it sounds kinda sick, but swinging a baseball bat strapped with a saw blade into the side of a zombie's head is never not going to be fun.
Okay.
I think that's what makes it so great, the customizability of the weapons. So you might find yourself a nice little 2x4 walking around like Hacksaw Jim Duggan did back in the day. But what's to stop you hammering some nails through the top of it? And now you've not just got a stick, you've got a stabby stick. And that's always going to be infinitely more fun. These slight alterations to these everyday items just changes the dynamic completely. And it also really adds to that survivalist mentality that you have in Days Gone. Most of the melee weapons that you find lying around are pretty useless taken as they are, but once you start to mix them up, attach different bits, they are really great and they're actually some of the best parts of the game. The gunplay in Days Gone is facing a bit of an uphill battle. Compared with the melee combat, I'll admit, it isn't quite as strong, but there's a pretty huge catalogue of weapons to suit every playstyle. The trouble is that even when that's the case, over-the-shoulder third-person shooters always have a difficult time actually making the guns feel different. And to be honest, Days Gone does a fairly good job of it. Whether it's the range, the rate of fire, the stopping power, the accuracy, with some pretty nice variation between all of the weapons, even in the same class. I mean, there's a handful of shotguns for instance, but they don't all feel and play the same. Weapons themselves are separated by condition and spec, so at the start of the game you start out with level 1 weapons, working your way through to level 5 weapons. It's pretty generic, there's nothing overly new about it, but it actually does suit the setting of the game. I mean, it makes sense that your average marauder isn't carrying around a military spec weapon, just the same as Deacon. At the start of the game, he's carrying around a bog standard pistol and his crossbow, but as you progress through, you meet bigger and better camps, the fortifications, their armories are stronger, you acquire these better guns, and it really does complement the story. There is also a staggering amount of throwable weapons and traps that you can enjoy. I mean, I'm not too sure what they were thinking with the bear traps. You can't even put them in your inventory, and half the time I just ended up running into them myself. But outside of that, there really is copious amounts of choice for you as the player, depending on how you choose to tackle any given scenario. Now, I'm trying to tell you that Days Gone is underrated, not that it's perfect. The mission design, for example, can leave a fair bit to be desired. It's separated into a few key areas. So you've got the marauder camps and you've got the ambush camps. Outside of the main story, these are really the only two key parts of the game that actually involve humans, at least as enemies that is. The basic structure of these is to go to an enemy base and clear it. If you've played pretty much any open world game in the last 10 years, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Because we've been here before.
Once the enemies have been lovingly dispatched, you're free to loot the base and you're even free to discover their bunker. It often takes quite a bit of time to find these and can be a bit of a ball ache. But luckily, the combat makes it all worth it. While the missions themselves get quite repetitive, going in there with a baseball bat or guns blazing never stops being fun, and that's what kept me going back. Luckily, where the game excels is with the hordes. These missions are tense, exciting, and I think I just about shit myself a few times while playing them. I mean, you're getting chased by literally hundreds of zombies, and it's an absolute work of art to get these things to run without a single dip in frame rate throughout my entire playthrough. They really challenge you to think about your playstyle going in as well. What guns you take, the traps, the throwables. Your success really does depend on how much thought you put into these things going in. Not only that, but there's a couple of ways you can tackle them, and using your bike to your advantage is also a great strategy. I think it's just where everything in the game comes together and works seamlessly, and I can really understand why these parts were shown off in the trailers. They're really unique and they just happen to be amazing fun as well. Of course, on top of all this is the simple act of cruising around on your motorbike. When you first get it, it might be a little bit underwhelming, but as soon as you start putting modifications on there, it becomes really good fun. And to be honest, just driving around on the thing really made up such a good majority of my playthrough. Just a bit of a shame that you can't actually do a wheelie in the game.
I can't believe you've done this.
There is, however, tons of customization options. As a nice touch, some of these are Easter eggs from other games, which is a pretty cool addition. So the game looks gorgeous and is actually surprisingly great to play, but what about the story? I mean, that is the main thing that keeps you going back to a game. Well, in Days Gone's case, it really is the main selling point of the game for me. Reviewers called it unoriginal and uninspiring. And yeah, I mean, it isn't the most original story, but it is engaging. The characters are believable and quite relatable, and Deacon's hunt to find Sarah really did have me gripped from start to finish. Another common criticism was the lack of character development for Deacon. And while his arc isn't one of personal self-discovery, it does take him from having lost his wife and being pretty distraught over that fact to, well, I don't want to spoil it for you. But the conclusion is satisfying, and the cast of side characters that Deacon meets along the way really helps to draw you back into the story as you go through. I never got a sense that the story was standing still or necessarily doing the easy thing. It's constantly doing something new and introducing you to new sets of characters, but each different camp does feel real, and each of the characters who live there are equally fleshed out. Of course, most of this is due to some absolutely phenomenal voice acting, not just by Sam Witwer, who voices Deacon, but by those who do the side characters too. I mean, Iron Mike, for example, Boozer. These are two characters who you could easily argue fill a pretty common stereotype, but thanks to the voice acting, they don't really feel like that while you're playing the game. Again, it comes back to the point that Days Gone isn't necessarily doing anything groundbreaking, but what it is doing, it's doing really well. One unfair criticism I see of Days Gone is the dialogue, and it's just simply not as bad as it's made out to be. That wedding scene, for example, okay, in isolation, it sounds stupid, but when you hear it in the context of the story and you understand the different in-jokes between Sarah and Deacon, it actually makes perfect sense and is a pretty funny moment. I can think of much worse from video games in the past couple of years, and I'm looking at you, Kojima.
Run.
Yeah. Like Mario and Princess Peach.
All in all, it's definitely a story I felt invested in. There's some really likeable characters, some that you'll really hate, and some pretty cool twists as well. Not to mention that surprise ending, which sets up a sequel in a pretty interesting way. The truth is, if you never wanted to give Days Gone a go, I totally get why. I was in that boat before as well. But when I saw it was free on the PlayStation Store, I just thought, why not? And I'm really glad I did, because it turned out to be one of the best games I've probably played in the last couple of years, especially at a time when the PS5 has so few titles to actually play. Is Days Gone perfect? Well, the answer to that is probably no. But is it underrated? Massively. I just don't really get the initial criticisms of it. Yes, okay, there were a few glitches, but just look at some of the scores that Cyberpunk got. I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. So if you're able to pick it up for free off the PlayStation Store, or you see it on a deal, make sure you pick it up and give it a try. In the meantime, drop us a like, don't forget to subscribe, and check us out at downtimebros.com.